Hello and welcome to Beyond the Seams podcast, the official podcast of ModelFront Chronicles, where we go deep into the technical aspects of builds, the history of builds, and how we accomplish it all using AI. I'm your host, Kurt Giese, and today we're going to take a look at the final steps of our North African build called Desert Sentinel, and we're going to talk about the final weathering. I'm going to skip right past the episodes where we pre-assembled and painted the figures, and I'm going to go straight into the final groundwork. During this episode, I'll break down the technical steps for achieving a realistic desert weathering. Also in this episode, we're going to provide a historical context of how the Germans used comms tents and sandbag barricades in World War II North Africa. The question for this episode is, did the dark yellow ochre I applied on the base, did that create the perfect desert dust effect? Let's find out. Okay, before I applied any color, I prepared the desert floor by applying a smooth, consistent coat of Vallejo White Primer. I primed this base with matte white because it was going to seal the surface and gave me an ideal canvas to work off. So I began the weathering process, and it was a three-step process. The first step was applying the base coat to the desert floor. In this step, I mixed Vallejo Buff 70.976 with white 70.951 and a tiny drop of chocolate brown 70.872, and this gave the mix warmth and a nice matte foundation for the desert sand. I applied this thin uniform base coat over the entire white prime ground, and I allowed the layer to dry completely before I moved on to the next step. Okay, while the desert floor was drying, I began to apply the precision pin wash onto the sandbags. For this, I used Tamiya black panel line color. After allowing it to settle, I carefully cleaned the flat areas. And then immediately after cleaning the sandbags, I dry brushed the sun exposed edges using a diluted mix of Vallejo khaki and white. Next, I applied a concentrated layer of Vallejo Dark Yellow Ochre pigment along the base of the sandbags, feathering the dust upward to eliminate any visual seams. Using a pipette, I then saturated the pigment with Vallejo Pigment Binder, and I allowed the medium to wick into the sand and permanently fix the dust particles into place. This episode's workflow was influenced by AI. So when I calculated the desert pigment layers, I fed historical aerial photos into AI, and it determined the exact ratio of the dark yellow ochre to buff needed to replicate the sun-faded hue found in the specific area of North Africa that we're modeling. And this saved tons of hours and human trial and error. And now that the base coat is finally dry, I moved to step 2, dry brushing for texture. To create the highlight color, I made an extremely pale color. I loaded a stiff flat brush with paint and then vigorously wiped nearly all of it off onto the paper towel, and the brush felt dry. Finally, I used quick, light, and random strokes to drag the brush across the entire textured surface. Doing so, the paint caught the highest peaks and ridges, and it made the ground look rough, dry, and emphasized the texture. I fixed this layer permanently by saturating with the pigment binder, and then the process was completed by a final soft dry brushing of Vallejo Buff over the surface to highlight the sand. So taking a look at the accessories, the structural elements, I permanently glued and affixed the tent first to the base. I then weathered the tent, same technique as some of the other accessories, is dry brushing the canvas using Vallejo Buff, and this was to emphasize the texture on the tent. For the accessories, I next glued the radio crate to the base and applied the same dark yellow ochre pigment to the ground seams. I completed the radio by applying Vallejo gloss varnish to the dials, and this was to simulate the glass surface of the radio. The fence posts, they received a base coat of Vallejo wood, and the fence wire, I painted that Vallejo whole red. It provides a nice historical look. I then formed the cables, the power cable and the microphone cable. I painted those black. So before we place the final figures during this podcast, let's take a minute and dive into the history that inspired the elements that I chose for this model. You know, if you look back at World War II history, you see communication tents, sandbags, and fence barricades so often in North African modeling. But why? Well, the radio crate, the cables, and the tent you see are of a typical German Funkstelle. That's a radio station. A tent provided the essential shelter and camouflage from aerial reconnaissance. The tent also housed critical equipment like the FU-8 radio, which was the nerve center of operations. They also extensively used sandbags, which was vital for reinforcing communication trenches and radio installations. So that those sandbags absorbed the blast and fragments and that any metal couldn't stop. The barricades and barbed wire were primarily used for perimeter security and traffic control. So every piece tells a story of protection, communication, and survival. And I wanted to depict the unforgiving environment of the North African campaign. So that's the history behind the elements and how I incorporated that into the build. So nearing the completion of the build, I had to affix the DAK soldier to the base in his final position. So I addressed the transitions to eliminate any visible seams around him by carefully applying a thick textured paste of hobby sand and glue. To finalize the blend, I dry brush that in areas to protect every piece and make sure that every piece looks settled and into the sand. So that completes our detailed journey of episode 5, Desert Sentinel. You know, in a few simple steps, we've transformed a cedar base into a gritty, sun-baked diorama. And the question I have is, did the dark yellow ochre create the perfect desert dust effect? Tell me your favorite technique from this build in the comments section. You know, if you want to see more step-by-step guides like this, please hit the like button and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next build. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please take a moment to like this episode and go ahead and subscribe to Beyond the Seam podcast. You don't want to miss any future builds. That concludes another deep dive into the world of scale modeling. Thank you for tuning in. This is Beyond the Seam podcast, the podcast of ModelFront Chronicles. Join us next time as we continue to explore the technical, historical, and digital frontiers of the hobby.